Thank you, Torrin. Okay, I'm going to read today from John's Gospel, chapter 2, beginning with verse 1. And this is a follow-up in a way, from what we talked about last week. You remember last week we read the story also from John's Gospel about the miracle of Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000. And I made the point when we discussed that last week that these miracles of Jesus many times, in fact, John's gospel goes out of his way. John goes out of his way in his gospel to bring this to the forefront, that many of his miracles, they weren't just happenstance or just random things that happened because of circumstances, that Jesus deliberately did things to, in a sense, provide a teaching opportunity with vivid, real-world things. And they are miraculous, that's true. But to make a bigger point, a spiritual point, beyond just the physical thing that happened. For instance, in the feeding of the 5,000, that big crowd was there, and Jesus went out of his way to point up the disciples' inability to do anything about it, to feed them. He asked Philip, if you remember, hey Philip, where are we going to get food to feed these people? And John tells us that he already knew what he was going to do, but he was he was using that as an opportunity to teach a bigger spiritual message. Because frankly, Jesus came into a world, the world of what for us is the Old Testament. For them it was their covenant with God. And things were going to change, and a new reality was about to be inaugurated. And Jesus was using every opportunity he could to explain it or illustrate it. And you remember he pointed up to Philip. His first thing he did was make it plain that from the human side of things, the human capacity was inadequate to meet the need. And then he met the need and fed the people in a miraculous way. And then he went on to make the point that, when they came around and found him and said, let's do that again. He made the point that, there's spiritual things are more important than physical things. And that's where we read, labor not for that bread which perishes, but that which is everlasting life, which I, the Son of Man, will give you. Making a point that what he did was to illustrate the fact that, humanly speaking, we're not capable of reaching what he can give us for free by himself. He provides for us what we cannot provide for ourselves. So I don't want to go through all that again, but John in his gospel, this is the point I'm making, goes out of his way to suggest and pretty much tell us that the miracles of Jesus, many of them, are used as opportunities to teach or to explain or to illustrate the new realities concerned with the new covenant. And so this one in chapter 2 is like that. This is, as a matter of fact, John tells us, the first miracle of Jesus. So let's read about it and see what we can learn from it. This is in John chapter 2. It says, "And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples," that means invited, in other words, "to the marriage." Verse 3, "And when they wanted wine," that means they ran out or they didn't have it, they were in need of it. In some ways this is kind of parallel to the story we read last week where they were in need of food. In this case it's wine. When they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Verse 4, "Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." Now we need to pause here for just a minute and talk about that. First of all, it seems like from our point of view, 2,000 years after the fact, and in a completely different culture, and from our modern, way of looking at things, this sounds like kind of a rude or kind of an unfriendly answer certainly kind of brusque, it seems like. So the first thing to point out is when he addressed her, his mother, as woman, that was not meant to be insulting or derogatory or insensitive or pushing her away or anything like that. From what I've been able to understand, that was actually in the first century, both in Jewish and Greek culture, kind of a formal, polite way to address someone, sort of like how we say ma'am today. And I'll just draw to your attention the fact that Jesus addressed her exactly the same way at the very end of John's Gospel, where Jesus is being crucified. He's hanging on the cross, and Mary is there standing next to John, the author of this Gospel, and he says to her, "Woman, behold thy son," meaning John. In other words, John's going to take care of you from now on. And he addressed her exactly the same way there. So we can not think that he's, being rude or unfriendly. Of course, we wouldn't want to think that anyway. But then the next part is, it makes us kind of scratch our head, and we want to know what he's talking about. He says, "Woman, what have I to do with thee? For mine hour is not yet come." Now, when Jesus says, "My hour is not yet come," this is also an expression that crops up several times in John's Gospel, "my hour," and in a similar kind of context. And in every case, when Jesus says "my hour," it comes up 4 times in John's Gospel. In chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 12, and chapter 17. In each case, it's a reference to his death on the cross, or his redemptive work on the cross. The event that inaugurates the new order of things, the new reality. It sets in motion, we might say, brings into reality the new order of things that we find in the new covenant. And I think that's probably the best way to understand this. You could, some commentators think that the reason he said that is he wanted to keep this on the lowdown, keep it private, and not show, a dramatic demonstration of his, his role right here in the very beginning. But I think I'm more toward the former point of view when he says, "My hour is not yet come." He's, Jesus, if you didn't notice it from the story we read last week about the feeding of the 5,000, he's always thinking on a spiritual plane, not just necessarily the physical, natural plane. He's always thinking on a higher level, and I think he's thinking to himself, as we see what's going to happen here, he's making an analogy, spiritually speaking. My hour to do what this is going to represent has not yet come. So we're going to see what it represents. But he's always thinking spiritually, as far as I'm concerned. So, at any rate, his mother, Mary, she didn't really respond to that. She just turned around and said to the servants, "Whatever he says to you, do it." In other words, I'm not going to argue with you. She just says, if whatever he tells you, just do what he says. Implying that he might ask them to do something that might not, they might scratch their heads about. So she kind of understood how Jesus operates. He's thinking spiritually, evidently. So you might not understand what he's going to do, but just do whatever he says. That's kind of how I take that. So verse 6, it says, "There were set 6 water pots of stone, after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece." Now, in my Bible, it says a firkin is 9 gallons. But that doesn't really matter. They're big, in other words, big water pots. But let's just talk about what this means. Why did John tell us this? These 6 stone water pots. It says, after the manner of the purifying of the Jews. Now, we might just read on over that and not really think about it, but I think it's important to stop and say, what does he mean? What did he mean by the manner of the purifying of the Jews? Well, there was a tradition in which water was used for ritual purification, not for hygiene necessarily, like we wash our hands for that purpose, but in a ritual or a symbolic way. Hands and sometimes arms were washed before meals in a sign of ritual purification, as a way of saying, I separate myself from everything in the world that this food or these utensils might have come in contact with. Now, this was not commanded by the Old Testament law, but it was practiced by the Pharisees. They believed that the Pharisees believed that Moses gave more instructions than those that were recorded in the written part of the law. The Pharisees believed that Moses gave private or secret or oral instructions to what they called the elders, those people that were around him at the time who handed it down by word of mouth. And so that's why they did these things. It was a way of the Pharisees demonstrating that how much better they were than everybody else, just to be honest with you. Demonstrating their own purity and holiness by engaging in all this ritual kind of washing. Now, you know, the other Gospels also mention this. Torin, if you could just for a second go to another reference in Mark chapter 7, starting with verse 1. Let's just read what this says. Mark, I'm going to turn around and read it here. Then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. Okay. Let's get the next one. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, with unwashed hands, they found fault. In other words, they saw Jesus' disciples eating bread without, and again, this has nothing to do with hygiene. This is not like the way we wash our hands, you know, for hygienic purposes. This is merely symbolic because of this tradition that they believed was handed down from the elders, that you should wash your hands to symbolically show that you are pure from everything else in the world. So it said with unwashed hands, it said they found fault, or they criticized the disciples. Okay, let's get the next one. Look at what Mark tells us about this. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft or often, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. Okay, let's get the next one. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups, pots, brazen or brass vessels, and of tables. Now you see Mark in his gospel goes into all this detail to point out this practice of the Pharisees, and he says here all the Jews. From what I've been able to understand, it's mostly the Pharisees had this idea, and they claimed that it was instructions handed down going back to Moses through the elders through oral tradition. So you have to wash, what did it say here? Let's see, cups, pots, brazen vessels, tables, you know, the things that contain the food. And you know, frankly, and you can sort of sense between the lines, Mark is being a little bit sarcastic. Can you sense that in what he's saying here? It would be like if we went to buy our food at the market or Walmart or the one downtown, and then we came home and said, before I eat, I've got to wash all these plastic bags and these containers that the food was in. I got to wash that, and then I got to wash my hand. Now I'm going to have to wash the table. I mean, of course, we wash the table if the table's dirty, but just before you eat, every time you got to wash the table and all the cups and all the silverware, and then my arms, and you know, it's just a show, really, is all this is. And I think you can sense that. Now, before we go back to the story of the marriage, I want you to see what Jesus had to say, because this is really important to understand what happens here. Jesus' attitude about the Pharisees and their practices, and this is found, Torin, in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 23, beginning with verse 25. And I'll just read it off the screen here. This is an occasion where this took place is in the temple. And at the very end of Jesus' ministry, he went into the temple one last time and confronted the Pharisees and really took them to task and criticized them to their face. And here, as you see, he calls them hypocrites. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you make clean the outside of the cup and the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess." Now, can you see what he's alluding to? He's talking about this practice of the Pharisees of washing all these pots and pans and cups and vessels, and he's saying you are hypocrites. You're washing all these things in a show, but really, he says, the problem is not on the outside, it's on the inside. Extortion and excess are characteristics of the heart and of the ethical part of a person. He's saying you are making a show by washing all these things where everybody can see you, demonstrating how clean you're making, before you eat and so forth. But there's a deeper problem, is what he's saying. Torrin, if you could go on to the next verse. Look at what he says next. "Thou blind Pharisee," listen to this now, "cleanse first that which is within the cup and the platter, that the outside of them may be clean also." Now he's using their practice of cleaning and washing all the vessels and the cups and so forth as a symbol or a metaphor or an illustration of a spiritual truth. What he's saying is the problem is not getting clean on the outside. The problem is what's going on the inside. And how do you reach that? You see, that's where the real issue is here. How do you get at, he's not talking about pots and pans, he's talking about people. He's talking about human beings. You see, we think that way, and this is what the Pharisees, he calls them hypocrites for thinking. We think that if we clean up on the outside, then that should be sufficient. But the problem is one of the nature and the inner self, not the outside. What he suggests here, Jesus does, he says if you could get at what's within, if you could ever clean that, the outside would follow. Now, I sometimes illustrate this truth this way. If you were, let's say, a farmer and you had a pig in your yard, a big, nasty pig, one of the great big ones, and I don't know if you've ever been around pigs very much, but they tend to be kind of messy animals, and they're known for wallowing in the mud and so forth. And what they eat is, they call it slop, and pigs are kind of dirty, animals. They have that reputation. But let's just say you're a farmer and you got this pig, and suddenly you come to a realization that I've got a stinking pig in my yard. And so you think, what would be better is if I had a beautiful house cat. So you could exert your human ability and your effort and try to clean the pig. You could take the pig, theoretically, you could take him into your house, put him in the bathtub and scrub him down real good. It'd be a lot of work, a lot of sweat, a lot of scrubbing, and you could, wrestle that pig into the bathtub, and he's fighting back the whole time. But you could scrub, theoretically, you could scrub him down and get him all clean. And then you could spray him with your wife's perfume and tie a ribbon in his hair. But the truth is, all of your effort to clean the pig does not change the fact that by nature it's still a pig. You do not have a house cat. And all of that activity and all of that effort to clean the outside of what is by nature a pig is really to no avail at all, because the minute you leave the door open, the pig's going to run straight out the door and right back to the mud again, because he is by nature a pig. And so what Jesus is intimating or getting at here, and what we're going to see in this story we're reading about the marriage, humanly we are incapable of dealing with what is actually the problem, which is the problem of the inside, the problem of the nature. But though we can't do it, he can do it. This is just like the story we read last week, where Jesus made a point to show Philip that humanly you are incapable of doing what needs to be done, but Jesus is fully capable. Jesus, as we're going to see, can change what's on the inside. Now, I've told this story. I haven't told it here for a little while, it seems to me, but I've told this story a lot. And it's not original with me, by the way. I think, I can't remember who, but you know, what my attitude is, if I hear some preacher tell a story, I think it's good, I just take it, and now it's my story. But anyway, I've told this story a lot. And as you know, because I mention it all the time, on Sunday nights I go out to BJCC, which is, they call it not a prison so much as a drug offender work camp, but it's a prison. But it's a minimum security prison, but most of the guys there are younger guys. And they're pretty good guys. You know, I get to know some of them, and I tell them basically the same things we talk about here. We sing the same songs, and I talk about the same things. And very rarely, but sometimes, some of those men, when they go home, I'll hear from them again, and they'll tell me things about their experiences. There's one particular guy who went home, and his mother was so thrilled with the change in her son that she began supporting our church for our prison ministry. And every year she sends me a check for the church, a donation, and she says, I so appreciate, because their son said those Sunday night services, that's the only bright spot in my week, you know. So that's really nice. I'm glad about that. But not this guy, but a different man. He went home, back to his home, and about a year went by, and he called me on the phone, and he told me this story. He said, when I first came home, all of my old friends came around and wanted me to go party with them. And I told them no. I said, I'm not going to do that because you're going to get me in trouble again, and I'm going to end up right back where I was at BJCC in Alva. And by the way, I do run into guys there who say, hey, remember me back 15 years ago? I say, yeah, good to see you again, I guess. Yeah. But anyway, this man was in a different category. He called me up and he said, I told my friends, no, I'm not going to go party with you. I'm going to go to church and make some new friends who won't get me in trouble. That's pretty smart. I told him that. I said, well, good for you. But he said, but wait, that's not why I called. I wanted to tell you that they all got mad at me, which you can understand. That offended them when he said that to them. And they all said bad things about me, and you know, and so forth, and they didn't show up around anymore. But one, after a few weeks or a period of time, I don't remember, one of them came back to him, and he told me, I just remember this detail because it was so vivid. He said he was a truck driver, those big 18-wheelers, and he drove that big old 18-wheeler up in front of this guy's house, and he said, come sit with me in my truck, I want to talk to you. And so he did, and this friend of his said, you know, when you came back here, when you were released from prison, and you said you weren't going to go party with us, we all got mad at you. And we said nasty things about you, and we made fun of you. And but then he said the guy teared up and began to cry, and he said, but I can see that your life is different. And whatever it is that you found, I need it too. So, you know, I don't know what was going on in his life, but it made an impression on him. And so he thought to himself, I don't really know for sure what to say to this guy. But so he said, he told me on the phone, I thought back to when you used to talk to us on Sunday nights, and the first thing that came to mind was that story about the pig. And I told him that story. You know, you can't clean up the pig. In other words, you can't clean up but Jesus can do it for you. He can change what's on the inside, you see. And I told him that story about the pig. And he said, yeah, I get that. Okay, that makes sense to me. And then he said, we prayed a little prayer together. And he told me after that, after we said amen, I couldn't think of what to say next. And we just sat there for a minute, and I said, well, praise God, brother, you're not a pig anymore. Which is kind of funny, but it makes a good point. Now, see, that truth that I just illustrated to you with that pig story, that's what Jesus is getting at when he's talking to these Pharisees. Let's go on reading. Let's get another one. Torrin, if you can give me the next verse. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but within are full of dead men's bones and uncleanness. Let's get one more verse. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Now, you see, he's making the same contrast that we've been talking about. And what he's saying about the Pharisees is they are hypocrites because they, what did he say? You appear righteous to men. And you see, you can change the outward impression of your life, but Jesus is saying that's not what I'm after. That's not the goal of this. Now, I think many times Christians do think that's the goal, to appear righteous unto men. Everybody look at me and you know. What Jesus is saying is if you get the inside clean, the outside will take care of itself. It's a completely different thing. And I like to illustrate this with another story, which I don't think I've told for a little while. So it goes like this. If you had a tree, now we had the pig a while ago, now we're talking about a tree. If you had a tree in your yard and you realized that it was bearing fruit that was stinky, smelly, unpleasant, bad fruit, and you suddenly become aware of that, you could say to yourself, I got to do something about that fruit. It smells terrible and it looks terrible, and so I'm going to do something about that. So you could, if you had a lot of energy, you could get your ladder and climb up in that tree and start pulling it off piece by piece and change the impression of the tree. It's a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of effort, a lot of strenuous striving, which many people think that's what the Christian life is all about. But it'd be a lot of work, but you could theoretically do it. You could pull all the fruit off. The trouble is, once you work your way around the tree, it's starting to pop out again on the other side where you started, so you've got quite a task on your hands. But then after if you could, let's say you could, pull off all that bad fruit, now what you have is a barren tree. So now what you've got is another problem. You have to put good fruit in its place, which is a different challenge entirely. And so I guess thinking, using your imagination, you could go to Hobby Lobby or one of those stores like that, and they have artificial fruit for sale there, and it's very, very realistic. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not, but they have plants and things, and they have artificial apples and oranges and bananas and pineapple, all this fruit. You could go and buy that artificial fruit and then get yourself a hot glue gun or something and glue it onto that tree and make it look really good. Now again, this is going to be even more work to put all that on there. Quite a task, a lot of work, but you could theoretically do it. But now what you have is an artificial tree. You have something that what Jesus is calling the Pharisees, he called them hypocrites. He said, you appear one way to men, but on the inside it's not the same. That's what a hypocrite is. That's what you've got now through all of your effort. You've got something that's phony or something that's artificial, man-made. Jesus is here saying, that's not what I want. That's not what this thing's all about. What really needs to happen is, if you've got a tree that's producing bad fruit, what really needs to happen is for that thing to get rooted up and pulled out and thrown away, and a new tree planted in its place, which will naturally produce good fruit. In other words, the nature of the thing has to change, not the outward fruit that appears. Now, I think in the Christian world, we fall into this trap of judging things by outward appearance and putting all the emphasis on actions and behavior. Jesus does not do that. He does not put all the emphasis on actions and behavior, but on the heart. That's why he's constantly being criticized by the Pharisees for associating with, the lower part of society, the tax collectors and the people of bad reputation and so forth. Now, having said all of that and made that illustration, now we can go back, Torrin, to John chapter 2, back to our marriage of Cana of Galilee. And let's start again with verse 6, chapter 2, verse 6. Now, you remember where we left off. the mother of Jesus, Mary, said to the servants, whatever he says to you, just do it. And it said in verse 6, there were 6 water pots of stone after the manner of the purifying of the Jews. Now we understand what that means. And we can also understand that Jesus is about to do something. You see, this, it's not by accident that John tells us this. He's about to do something that is, you might say, in response to or a reaction to this practice of the Pharisees of ritual purification, which really had no value and didn't really do anything, but just made a show out of it. So Jesus takes those water pots. Verse 7, he says to them, remember the mother said, whatever he says, do it. Well, here he's going to tell them what to do. Jesus said to them, fill all the water pots with water. And they filled them to the brim. I mean, that's what he told them to do, right? Verse 8. And he saith unto them, draw out now, and bear to the governor of the feast. And they bear it, or they did it. Now, I'm sure, it doesn't tell us this, but I'm sure they were thinking, uh-oh, you got us fill this up with water, and they've run out of wine, so now we're going to take these pots of water to the guy in charge of the feast. But they did what he said, right? Verse 9. And when the ruler had tasted the water, listen, that was made wine. Now, how'd that happen? Jesus did it. Let's go on reading. The ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew. The governor of the feast called the bridegroom. Verse 10. And he saith unto him, every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. And then in verse 11, John tells us, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed on him. And that's the goal of it. Now, the governor of the feast said, do you understand what he means? By the way, I've read lots of Bible commentators. That's my job, to read, see what everybody says about things. And I've come across certain branches, certain denominations in Christianity who get offended by this story because in their denomination or their branch of Christianity, they condemn the drinking of any kind of alcohol whatsoever. And so I've seen people try to finesse this story and say, well, Jesus turned it into non-alcoholic wine. Now that's just nonsense, and that's just silly, and there's really no point in that. There's no prohibitions against drinking alcohol in the Bible. There are prohibitions against getting drunk. But what proves that theory of non-alcoholic wine or grape juice is false is because the governor of the feast said, what most people do is they put out the good wine at the beginning, and then after everybody is drunk. That's what he means when he says, when men have, how is the exact expression here in verse 10? At the beginning they set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, they put out that which is worse. Do you understand what he's saying? When they are drunk and they can't really, their senses are kind of blurred, and they can't really perceive things, they're kind of dulled, in other words, then they bring out the cheap wine because they won't know the difference. There's no other way to read that than that. And what he's saying here is, you have saved the best. See, not only did Jesus make it into wine, but he made it into wine that was better than what was expected. I guess so. If he's going to make wine, he might as well make the best. And so the governor of the feast said, wow, this is really spectacular. You've saved the best for last. But to get hung up on whether it was alcoholic wine or not, and it was alcoholic wine, and that's what they drank in those days. In fact, there were health reasons for doing it because the water was frequently contaminated and people got sick. And that's why at the Last Supper they drank wine. At meals, it was typical, and in parts of the Middle East, it still is today, and in some parts of Europe, it still is typical to drink wine to avoid drinking the water, which maybe perhaps is not pure, and you can get kind of digestive problems from it. In fact, in one of Paul's epistles, he writes to Timothy, and he says, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. So Jesus definitely made, just as it says here, wine. But that misses the point. To get hung up on whether it's alcoholic or not, that has I was almost to say, that is a good illustration of what Jesus is condemning the Pharisees for. When I had you read from Matthew's Gospel a while ago, I was trying to get at the very wording that I was looking for, but if you'd back up in that condemnation of the Pharisees, he said, you know what you Pharisees are like? You strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. And this denominational religious fussing over whether it's alcoholic wine or non-alcoholic, that's like straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. The point is, you miss the point of what the story is about. What's the story about? The story is about this. Jesus changes what's on the inside. That's the point of the story. That's why he did this. He's thinking spiritually, and the whole reason he did this miracle is to illustrate that, yes, there is a need. The mother, remember how it started? The mother said they've run out of wine. They have no wine. And so Jesus filled it with common, ordinary water. And then he changed the inner contents. He changed that which is within. Just like those illustrations, I gave you before about the tree that produced bad fruit. Jesus fixes the problem not by putting good fruit on the outside and taking away the bad fruit, by changing the nature of the tree or the pig. He changes the nature of the person. Now, it's not just that this happened right here and without precedent. In the Jewish scriptures, what was to them their scriptures, what to us is the Old Testament, the prophet Ezekiel predicted this long before. And so, Torin, let's finish up with this. Find Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26. Ezekiel is, as a prophet, speaking for God and looking into the future and predicting the nature or the characteristics of this new arrangement or this new covenant. And notice what Ezekiel says here in chapter 36, verse 26. Torrance going to get it for us. A new heart also I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. When he says a new heart, he of course does not mean the physical pump in your chest that's making the blood go around your body. That's a metaphor for your inner self. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. In other words, I'll take away the thing that's dead and stony, and I'll give you one that's alive. Okay, what's the next verse say? And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you shall keep my judgments and do them. Now, in these verses, Ezekiel is predicting what Jesus came to bring in reality. You see, Jesus, his role as a Savior is not to change our behavior or not to change the outward aspect of our lives, but to give us, as Ezekiel predicted here, a new spirit or a new heart. And literally, it is the Spirit of Christ himself. He replicates himself inside of us. That's why Paul wrote to the Colossians, and he said, this is the secret that from ages in the past has been hidden and kept under wraps, but now God wants to be revealed to the saints. And the secret is this: Christ in you, the hope of glory. And that is what he's getting at, and that's what this story about the marriage of Cana of Galilee is meant to illustrate. What's the human side? What do we have to do with this? Well, our part is very small but important. We're just merely to agree or to believe. You notice at the end of this it said his disciples believed in him. That's always and exclusively what the human response is. To believe, say, yes, that's good enough for me. Because frankly, as he points out again and again, it's a job that's too big for you, too big for me. In fact, we're incapable of doing what needs to be done. But he is fully capable. And he's the one who takes care of what's on the inside. whereas we can't get out it. And Jesus said, as he told the Pharisees, once you get the inside clean, the outside will follow along. Okay, I think that's all we got today. And thank you for listening so patiently.